Welcome to my channel. I am Jade Malice. If the darkness in the corner of your room just moved, it means one of the uninvited guests from my story has already reached you. From which city? And at what time are you watching us? Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave a like so you don't get lost in the dark. Now, the story begins. Prepare yourselves. The shelter beneath Hollow Hill. No one in the small French village of Hollow Hill remembered exactly when the underground shelter had been sealed. The thick steel door stood at the edge of the forest, hidden beneath ivy and twisted roots. Older villagers claimed it had once protected families during the war. Others whispered that it had been closed for a far more disturbing reason. Every autumn, when the nights grew colder, strange knocking sounds echoed from beneath the earth, as if someone was still waiting inside. Police officer Daniel Brooks was sent to investigate, after several hikers reported hearing voices near the abandoned entrance. They insisted they had heard children laughing below the ground, even though the shelter had supposedly been empty for more than 70 years. Daniel dismissed the stories as imagination. Armed with a flashlight and a radio, he unlocked the rusted door and descended the narrow concrete staircase. The heavy door slammed shut behind him. He tried the handle. It would not move. The air inside was strangely warm. Dust covered the floor, yet there were no cobwebs anywhere. The shelter stretched into a maze of long corridors lined with old bunk beds, broken lockers, and faded emergency signs. Then he heard it. A soft knock. 3 slow taps. It came from the end of the hallway. Daniel followed the sound until he reached a small metal room filled with empty shelves. As soon as he stepped inside, the knocking stopped. His flashlight flickered. On one wall, someone had written a sentence in pale chalk. "Do not answer when they knock back." Before he could examine it further, another knock echoed behind him. 3 taps. This time, they came from the wall itself. Daniel froze. The concrete slowly vibrated beneath his hand. It sounded as though someone was trapped on the other side. "Is anyone there?" he called. Silence. Then, from inside the wall, a child's voice whispered, "We're almost through." A cold chill spread across his back. He stepped away just as tiny cracks appeared in the concrete. They were not spreading outward. They were spreading inward, as though invisible hands were pushing from the opposite side. Daniel hurried deeper into the shelter, searching for another exit. Instead, he found an old control room. The clocks had all stopped at exactly 2:41. An emergency log rested on the desk. Its final entry read, "The knocking has learned to imitate us. Nobody knows which side is safe anymore." Suddenly, his radio came alive. "Daniel, can you hear me?" Dispatch called. Relieved, he grabbed it. "I'm inside. I need assistance." A pause followed. Then the same voice replied, "No, you're outside." Static filled the radio. At that exact moment, someone knocked 3 times on the control room door. Daniel remained silent. Another 3 knocks. Slower. Closer. The handle turned by itself. The door creaked open. No one stood in the hallway. Only darkness. Then another knock echoed behind him. He spun around. This time, it came from inside the control room wall. The concrete bulged outward for a brief second. A small handprint appeared in the dust. Then another, and another. Dozens of tiny handprints slowly covered the wall before fading away. Without waiting another moment, Daniel followed an emergency tunnel that led upward. After several exhausting minutes, he forced open a hidden hatch and climbed into the cold night air. The shelter door behind him was once again sealed. Rescue teams searched the underground complex the following morning. They found no control room, no emergency log, no second tunnel. According to the original blueprints, none of them had ever existed. The case was officially closed. Weeks later, Daniel returned to his apartment after a late shift. As he set down his keys, 3 quiet knocks came from the bedroom wall. He held his breath. 3 more answered from the kitchen, then another from the ceiling. Finally, a child's familiar whisper drifted through the silence. We found the right side. The knocking has never stopped since. Every night, it moves a little closer to his bedroom door. The echo that never returned. Deep in the rugged Verdon Gorge in southeastern France, one of Europe's most breathtaking canyons, there was a narrow trail that locals refused to walk after sunset. The cliffs rose like dark walls above the river, and every sound echoed through the valley for several seconds. Yet the oldest villagers insisted there was one echo that never belonged to the person who made it. Police officer Daniel Foster was sent to the canyon after 2 experienced hikers disappeared without leaving a trace. Their backpacks had been found beside the trail, but there were no footprints leading away, no signs of a struggle, and no evidence that anyone had fallen into the river below. Daniel arrived late in the afternoon with mountain rescue volunteer Claire Morel. She knew every path through the canyon, but even she avoided looking toward a narrow stone passage known as Whisper Ridge. "My grandfather always told me one thing," Claire said quietly. "If the canyon answers with your own voice, don't answer back." Daniel smiled politely. He had investigated enough strange cases to know that fear often created stories where none existed. The search began in complete silence. Only the wind and the distant river accompanied them. As the sun disappeared behind the cliffs, Daniel called out the names of the missing hikers. His voice rolled through the canyon. "Mark." A few seconds later, the echo returned. Then another. But the second echo was different. It quietly whispered, "Daniel." Claire stopped walking. "You heard it too, didn't you?" Daniel nodded without speaking. They continued deeper into the canyon until they reached a natural stone bridge stretching over a dark crack in the earth. Below it, there was no visible bottom. Claire shined her flashlight downward. The light vanished into darkness, as though it had been swallowed. Then they heard footsteps. Slow, measured, coming from the opposite side of the bridge. A figure emerged through the evening mist. It looked exactly like one of the missing hikers. He walked calmly toward them. His clothes were clean. His face showed no fear. "You're alive!" Daniel shouted. The man stopped. He smiled. Then, without moving his lips, another voice echoed from every direction. "Not anymore." The figure dissolved into a cloud of grey mist. At that exact moment, both flashlights went out. The canyon became completely silent. Even the river had stopped making noise. Daniel felt someone standing just behind him. He turned. No one. Yet fresh footprints slowly appeared in the dust at his feet. One after another, as if invisible boots were walking past him. The footprints crossed the bridge, then vanished at its center. Claire's flashlight suddenly flickered back to life. For a brief second, dozens of shadowy figures stood along the cliffs above them. They watched without moving, without blinking, When the light steadied, they were gone. Trying to leave, Daniel discovered that every trail now looked identical. The canyon had become a maze. No matter which direction they chose, they always returned to the stone bridge. Then a distant voice echoed again. This time, it sounded exactly like Daniel. "I'm over here." Claire grabbed his arm. "That's not you." The voice repeated itself. "Closer." "I'm over here." Daniel resisted the urge to answer. Instead, they remained perfectly still. Minutes passed. The voice grew impatient, then angry. Finally, it stopped. A cold wind rushed through the canyon. The correct path suddenly appeared where solid rock had stood only moments before. They escaped just before dawn. The official investigation concluded that unusual acoustics and poor visibility had caused confusion among previous visitors. The missing hikers were never found. Months later, Daniel reviewed the audio recorder he had carried that night. Most of the recording contained only wind, until the very end. A calm voice whispered clearly into the microphone, "Thank you for not answering." The recording ended there. No one could explain how a second sentence had appeared in the official search report afterward. It was typed in the same font as the rest of the document, yet no officer admitted writing it. It read, "The canyon always calls twice. Those who answer the second voice never find the way home." The ranch where no sunrise came. Deep in the remote plains of Montana stood Black Hollow Ranch, an enormous property surrounded by endless fields, old fences, and silent forests. Travelers often passed its weathered entrance, but very few ever stopped. The locals believed the ranch had been cursed ever since its original owner vanished without a trace nearly 80 years earlier. They said the cattle disappeared on moonless nights. Horses refused to enter the western pasture, and every sunrise seemed to avoid that piece of land. Deputy Sheriff Ethan Brooks had spent his entire career dismissing ghost stories. When several ranch workers reported hearing voices calling their names after midnight, he assumed someone was trying to frighten them away. Determined to uncover the truth, he drove to Black Hollow Ranch one cold autumn evening. The owner, an elderly rancher named Samuel Reed, greeted him with tired eyes. "Whatever you hear tonight," Samuel warned, "don't answer if someone calls you from the fields." Ethan smiled politely. "I'll be fine." As darkness settled over the ranch, an unnatural silence replaced the usual sounds of insects and animals. Even the horses stood motionless, staring toward the western pasture. At exactly 1 o'clock in the morning, a distant voice drifted through the wind. "Ethan?" It sounded exactly like his younger brother, who had died years earlier. Ethan froze. The voice came again, closer this time. "Ethan, over here." Ignoring Samuel's warning, he grabbed his flashlight and walked toward the pasture. The grass swayed, although there was no wind. The beam of his flashlight suddenly flickered, revealing dozens of old footprints in the mud. Every footprint faced the same direction. None of them returned. Far ahead stood a lonely wooden gate. It slowly creaked open by itself. Beyond it lay a field covered in thick grey mist. Ethan stepped through. Immediately, every sound disappeared. His own footsteps made no noise. His breathing became strangely distant. Then he noticed figures standing among the fog. Cowboys, ranch hands, women carrying lanterns, children holding old hats. They were perfectly still. None of them had visible faces, only dark shadows beneath wide-brimmed hats. A horse suddenly galloped across the field. Its saddle was empty, yet the reins moved as though someone invisible held them. The horse stopped beside Ethan and lowered its head. Tied to the saddle was a rusted sheriff's badge. It belonged to Deputy Michael Brooks, Ethan's grandfather. The same grandfather who had disappeared while searching the ranch decades earlier. A whisper surrounded him. "We never left." The fog thickened. The silent figures slowly turned toward him at the same time. Without faces, they somehow seemed to be watching him. Ethan backed away. The wooden gate had vanished. Only endless mist surrounded him. Then a lantern appeared in the darkness. An old cowboy stepped forward. Unlike the others, his face was visible. It was Samuel. Not old and tired, young, exactly as he looked in photographs taken 50 years earlier. "You must leave before sunrise?" the young Samuel said quietly. "Why?" "Because the sun never reaches those who stay." The ground beneath Ethan trembled. The shadowy figures began walking toward him, not quickly, not angrily, just steadily, as though they had all the time in the world. Young Samuel pointed into the fog. A narrow path of light appeared. Ethan ran without looking back. Behind him came only one sound: hundreds of slow footsteps moving together. When he crossed the ranch gate, the first rays of morning finally touched the land. He turned around. The western pasture was empty. No mist, no figures, no footprints, only silent grass stretching toward the horizon. The investigation found nothing unusual. The missing workers had never been reported officially, and no records mentioned Ethan's grandfather visiting the ranch. Samuel simply smiled when Ethan asked about that night. "I told you not to answer the voices." Months later, Ethan received an old leather saddlebag with no return address. Inside was his grandfather's sheriff's badge. Attached to it was a faded photograph of Black Hollow Ranch. Dozens of ranch hands stood in front of the barn. At the edge of the picture stood Ethan himself. He remembered that photograph had been taken more than 60 years before he was born. On the back, written in fresh ink, were 7 chilling words. "We'll be waiting when the next sunrise disappears." The cellar beneath Hollow House. When Ethan Brooks accepted the task of inspecting Hollow House before its renovation, he expected nothing more than dust, broken furniture, and years of neglect. The old mansion stood alone in the countryside of northern France, surrounded by twisted trees that blocked most of the daylight. Local villagers rarely walked near it after sunset. They all repeated the same warning: "Whatever you do, never open the cellar after midnight." Ethan smiled politely. As an architectural surveyor, he had heard countless ghost stories attached to abandoned buildings. None of them had ever proved true. The first hours passed quietly. He photographed empty bedrooms, cracked staircases, and faded family portraits, whose eyes seemed strangely lifelike. Every clock inside the mansion had stopped at exactly 12:07. Just before midnight, while measuring the dining hall, he heard a dull metallic sound from beneath the floor. Clang. A pause. Then another. Someone or something was knocking from below. Following the noise, Ethan discovered a heavy wooden trapdoor hidden beneath an old carpet. A large iron lock hung from it, but the chain had already rusted away. His watch read 12:03. He remembered the villager's warning. Curiosity won. At exactly midnight, he pulled the trapdoor open. Cold air rushed upward, carrying the smell of damp stone and ancient earth. A narrow staircase disappeared into darkness. He switched on his flashlight and descended. The cellar was enormous. Shelves lined the walls, but instead of wine bottles, they held hundreds of old lanterns. Every lantern contained a tiny flame that burned without fuel. As Ethan stepped farther inside, another lantern lit itself. Then another. Soon, the entire cellar glowed with a soft golden light. At the center of the room stood a single wooden chair. On it rested an old guest book. His name was already written on the final page. Below it appeared today's date. The signature, however, was incomplete. Only the first letter of his surname had been written. A whisper drifted through the room. "Finish it?" Ethan spun around. No one stood behind him. The whisper came again, this time from every direction. "Everyone who enters signs." Suddenly, one lantern fell from its shelf. It did not shatter. Instead, it rolled slowly across the stone floor and stopped beside a narrow doorway he had not noticed before. Inside was another chamber. Its walls were covered with portraits. Every painting showed someone holding the same guestbook. Some wore clothing from centuries ago. Others looked surprisingly modern. All of them shared one unsettling detail. Their eyes had been painted completely black. Ethan backed away. The portraits moved. Not much, just enough to turn their faces toward him. The lanterns began swinging gently, although the air remained perfectly still. A deep voice echoed from the darkness. "You are late." Footsteps followed. Slow. Heavy. Approaching from the unseen end of the chamber. Ethan ran toward the staircase. The trapdoor above was closed. He pushed with all his strength. It would not move. Behind him, the footsteps stopped. Silence filled the cellar. Then a hand knocked softly on the underside of the trapdoor. 3 slow knocks. Someone was standing above. Relieved, Ethan shouted for help. A familiar voice answered. "You can come up now." It was the caretaker. Without thinking, Ethan forced the trapdoor open. Moonlight poured inside. The caretaker stood smiling. "You were only down there for a minute," he said. Ethan looked at his watch. It was nearly dawn. 6 hours had vanished. The caretaker frowned. "What guestbook?" There was no chair, no lanterns, no second chamber. The cellar contained nothing except empty stone walls. Weeks later, the renovation began. Workers repeatedly refused to enter the cellar. They claimed they heard quiet conversations below, even when no one was inside. On the final day of the project, Ethan received a package with no return address. Inside was an old leather-bound guestbook. Every page was blank, except the last one. His full signature now appeared in dark ink. Beneath it, a new line slowly formed as he watched. "The next guest is already on the stairs." The grave that waited. When Officer Daniel Harper was transferred to the quiet town of Ashmore in northern England, he expected little more than routine patrols and peaceful nights. The town was known for its centuries-old church, narrow stone streets, and an ancient cemetery that overlooked the surrounding hills. It was the kind of place where everyone knew each other, and nothing unusual ever seemed to happen. At least, that was what Daniel believed until the reports began. Several residents claimed they had seen a lone figure walking through the cemetery long after the gates had been locked. The stranger always wore a dark coat and carried an old lantern whose flame never flickered, even in strong winds. Whenever someone tried to approach, the figure disappeared among the gravestones without leaving a single footprint. Daniel dismissed the stories as local folklore. One foggy evening, After receiving another call from a frightened visitor, he drove to the cemetery alone. The iron gate was locked exactly as expected. Yet, as he shone his flashlight through the bars, he saw a faint light moving between the graves. Someone was definitely inside. Using the caretaker's spare key, Daniel entered the cemetery. The fog swallowed every sound. Even his footsteps seemed strangely distant. He followed the lantern until it stopped beside an old grave covered with cracked marble. The lantern rested on the ground, but the person carrying it was gone. Curious, Daniel brushed away years of moss from the weathered headstone. The inscription had almost disappeared. Only one sentence remained clear. He waits for the one who calls his name. Before Daniel could examine it further, he heard his own name whispered softly. Daniel. He spun around. No one. The cemetery was empty. Again the whisper came, closer this time. Daniel! It sounded neither male nor female, only familiar. He searched among the graves, convinced someone was hiding nearby. Instead, he noticed something impossible. Fresh footprints were appearing in the damp earth, one after another. As if invisible feet were slowly walking toward him. The footprints stopped less than a meter away. Silence returned, and the old lantern lit itself. Its pale flame cast long shadows across the cemetery. Every headstone around Daniel suddenly seemed occupied. Dark figures stood beside the graves without moving. Dozens of them. Their faces remained hidden beneath the thick mist. None of them blinked. None of them breathed. They simply watched. Daniel reached for his radio. Only static answered. Then every lantern hanging near the cemetery paths burst into life at the same moment. The fog glowed with an eerie golden light. The whisper returned. Read the other side. Confused, Daniel walked behind the old grave. There was another inscription carved into the stone. It looked newer than the front. Reserved. Nothing else. No name. No date. Only that single word. A freezing wind swept through the cemetery. The invisible footsteps began again. This time, they circled him slowly. Daniel felt as though someone was standing just behind his shoulder. He refused to turn around. After several endless seconds, the church bell rang once. The lantern's flame vanished instantly. The shadows disappeared. The cemetery became silent again. Daniel hurried back to the gate without looking behind him. The following morning, workers inspected the old grave. They found nothing unusual. No fresh footprints, no lantern, no second inscription. The stone appeared untouched for decades. Daniel never mentioned what he had seen in his official report. Months passed before he returned to the cemetery for a funeral. As the service ended, an elderly groundskeeper quietly approached him. "I've been meaning to give you this." He handed Daniel a rusted brass tag. It looked like part of an old burial marker. Engraved on its surface was only one word: reserved. That night, Daniel locked the tag inside his desk drawer. The next morning, it was gone. In its place lay a folded cemetery map. One grave was marked with fresh black ink. It was the same grave he had visited months before. But this time, a new name had appeared beneath the word reserved. It was his own. Ever since then, whenever Daniel passes an old cemetery after sunset, he never looks toward the lantern lights. Because somewhere beyond the fog, someone is still patiently waiting for him to answer when his name is whispered once again. Room 17, never checked out. On a lonely highway in the French countryside stood Ashwood Motel, a small roadside stop that had once welcomed travelers from across Europe. Time had faded its sign, cracked its windows, and emptied its parking lot. Yet truck drivers still whispered about a single room that always seemed occupied, even though no guest was ever seen entering or leaving. Police Sergeant Daniel Harper had heard the rumors for years, but dismissed them as ghost stories invented to entertain exhausted drivers. One rainy evening, however, the local police received 3 emergency calls from people claiming they had seen lights moving inside the abandoned motel. By the time officers arrived, the callers had disappeared without leaving a trace. Daniel decided to investigate alone. The motel lobby was silent, except for the slow dripping of rainwater through the damaged roof. A dusty reception bell sat on the counter beside an old guest register. Curious, Daniel opened the book. The last official entry was dated 27 years earlier. Every room had been marked as vacant, except room 17. No guest name, only the word waiting. A cold breeze passed through the hallway. One of the room doors slowly creaked open. It was room 17. Daniel drew his flashlight and stepped inside. The room looked strangely untouched by time. The bed was perfectly made. A suitcase rested beside the window. A table lamp glowed softly, although the motel had been disconnected from electricity for decades. Then the bathroom faucet turned on by itself. Water flowed steadily. Daniel approached. The mirror above the sink was covered with steam. Slowly, invisible fingers wrote 4 words across the glass. "Don't stay tonight." He spun around. Nobody stood behind him. The message disappeared as quickly as it had appeared. Suddenly, the motel telephone rang. The sound echoed through the room. Daniel answered. No one spoke. Only slow breathing. Then a calm voice whispered, "Someone checked in." But nobody checked out. The line went dead. Every light in the room instantly went out. Only the television switched on. Its screen showed black and white security footage of the motel corridor. Daniel watched himself standing inside, room 17. But another figure appeared behind him. Tall, motionless, its face hidden beneath a wide-brimmed hat. Daniel turned immediately. The room was empty. When he looked back at the television, the figure had moved closer. It was now standing only a few steps behind him. The screen suddenly filled with static. The suitcase near the window clicked open. Inside were neatly folded clothes, an old passport, and a police badge covered in dust. The badge belonged to Officer Michael Evans. Daniel recognized the name. Michael had vanished while investigating this very motel 20 years earlier. Before Daniel could examine the badge, heavy footsteps echoed outside. They stopped directly at the door. 3 slow knocks followed. Knock, knock, knock. "Police!" a familiar voice called. Daniel frowned. It sounded exactly like his own voice. He remained silent. Again came the knock. "Open the door!" This time the voice was louder, more impatient. Daniel slowly looked through the peephole. On the other side stood Daniel. Same uniform, same face, same flashlight. The man outside smiled. But Daniel realized one horrifying detail. His reflection outside never blinked. The doorknob slowly began to turn. Without thinking, Daniel climbed through the room's back window and dropped into the overgrown courtyard behind the motel. The moment his feet touched the ground, every light inside the building vanished. The motel returned to darkness. The following morning, a full police search found nothing unusual. Room 17 was empty. There was no lamp, no suitcase, no television. Only dust covered the floor. The old guest register, however, was still lying on the reception desk. This time, it contained one additional entry. Guest, Daniel Harper. Room 17. Status, awaiting checkout. Daniel resigned from highway patrol a month later and never drove that road again. Even so, every year, on the anniversary of that night, he receives a single postcard with no return address. On the front is a photograph of Ashwood Motel. On the back, only one sentence is written. Your room is ready, whenever you decide to return. The well that called every midnight. Hidden deep within the English countryside, beyond abandoned fields and tangled forests, stood the forgotten village of Hollow Ash. Most of its stone cottages had collapsed long ago, leaving only broken walls and empty windows staring into the silence. In the center of the village stood an ancient stone well. It had been sealed with heavy iron bars decades earlier, yet the locals still avoided walking near it after sunset. They believed the well was listening. Police Sergeant Ethan Walker had heard the stories many times while investigating reports of strange noises around Hollow Ash. Several hikers claimed they had heard someone crying for help near the abandoned well. Every search ended the same way. No footprints, no missing person, no explanation. Certain that someone was playing cruel tricks, Ethan decided to spend one night at the deserted village. Just before midnight, a cold wind swept through the empty streets. The trees remained perfectly still, yet the air carried the faint sound of dripping water. At exactly 12 o'clock, Ethan heard it. A quiet voice. "Help me." It came from the well. He approached cautiously and shone his flashlight through the rusted iron bars. The well seemed endless. Its walls disappeared into complete darkness. Again, the voice whispered, "I'm still here." Ethan called down, "Who's there?" No answer came. Instead, another sound echoed upward. Slow footsteps, as if someone was climbing unseen stairs hidden inside the well. The footsteps stopped. Then silence returned. Moments later, Ethan noticed something impossible. The rope that had once hung over the well slowly rose by itself. No one was pulling it. When the bucket finally reached the top, it wasn't empty. Inside lay an old police badge, covered in mud. The number engraved on it belonged to Officer Henry Collins, a policeman who had disappeared during an investigation in 1978. Ethan's heartbeat quickened. He placed the badge into an evidence bag. Suddenly, every crow in the surrounding forest took flight at once. Their cries filled the night. The flashlight flickered, then went out. Only the moonlight remained. A soft splash echoed from inside the well. Something had entered the water. Ethan switched to a spare flashlight. The beam reached the bottom for only a brief moment. He saw a man standing ankle-deep in black water. His old police uniform clung to his body. His face was hidden beneath the shadow of his cap. The man slowly lifted one arm and pointed upward. Not at Ethan. Behind him. Ethan turned. The abandoned village was no longer empty. Dozens of silent figures stood between the ruined cottages. Men, women, and children. All soaked as though they had just climbed out of deep water. None of them blinked. None of them moved. They simply watched. A whisper drifted through the cold air. "Don't answer." The words came from directly behind Ethan. He spun around. No one stood there. But the well was no longer sealed. The iron bars had vanished. The opening was completely exposed. The water below looked much closer than before. Then a hand emerged from the darkness. It gripped the edge of the stone. Another hand followed. Ethan stepped back. The figure climbing upward wore the same uniform as Officer Collins. Its movements were slow and unnatural. When its face finally appeared in the moonlight, there were no eyes, only endless darkness beneath the cap. The creature opened its mouth. Instead of speaking, the cries of dozens of people poured out together. Ethan ran. He did not stop until the first lights of morning appeared beyond the hills. The official investigation found nothing unusual. The well remained sealed behind its rusted bars. Officer Collins's badge had vanished from the evidence locker before sunrise. The case was quietly closed. Weeks later, Ethan returned to duty in another county. One rainy night, while finishing paperwork at the police station, his desk phone rang. The caller ID displayed only one word: hollow ash. He answered. For several seconds, there was only the sound of dripping water. Then the familiar whisper returned. You looked into the well. A long pause followed. Now, the well can look back. The line went dead. At that exact moment, a small puddle of water appeared beneath Ethan's chair. It spread silently across the floor. In its reflection, the dark opening of the ancient well was waiting. And something inside it was slowly climbing toward the surface once again. The last drawer in the morgue. Detective Ethan Brooks had investigated countless strange cases across England, but none of them prepared him for the call he received on a cold November evening. The old St. Bartholomew morgue, abandoned for nearly 20 years, had triggered its silent alarm for the third night in a row. The building had no electricity, no staff, and no reason for anyone to be inside. Assuming it was another group of trespassers, Ethan drove through the thick fog until the grey stone building appeared at the end of a deserted road. Its broken windows reflected the moonlight, and the rusted sign above the entrance swung gently, although there was no wind. The front door stood slightly open. Inside, the air smelled of dust, old disinfectant, and damp concrete. His flashlight swept across abandoned examination tables, cracked tiles, and empty metal cabinets. Everything was silent. Then he heard it. A metallic sound. Slow. Rhythmic. Someone was pulling open one of the morgue drawers. Ethan followed the noise into the old, cold storage room. Rows of stainless steel drawers lined both walls. Every drawer was closed. The sound stopped. He searched the room carefully, but found no one. Just as he turned to leave, drawer number 27 slid open by itself, with a long scraping sound. Inside, it was empty. Only a folded tag rested on the metal tray. Ethan picked it up. The paper was yellow with age. Written in a faded ink were only 4 words. Do not close it. A sudden bang echoed behind him. The heavy entrance door slammed shut. His radio filled with loud static before a faint voice whispered, "Someone is still waiting." The signal disappeared. Ethan tried to reopen the door. It would not move. When he looked back, drawer 27 had closed. Another drawer slowly opened. Number 14. It too was empty. Then number 8. Then number 31. One after another, the drawers began opening across the room without anyone touching them. Cold air flowed through the corridor. His flashlight flickered. In the polished steel of the drawers, Ethan noticed something impossible. His reflection was not alone. A tall figure stood directly behind him. He spun around. Nothing The room was empty. When he looked back at the metal surface, the figure was still there. Closer now. Its face remained hidden in darkness. Only its pale hands rested on the edge of drawer 27. The lights above suddenly came to life. The abandoned morgue glowed for the first time in decades. Every drawer slid open at once. Inside each one lay nothing but darkness. Yet soft breathing filled the room, dozens of breaths, slow and synchronized, as though invisible patience still occupied every drawer. Ethan backed toward the exit. A voice, calm and gentle, echoed through the room. "You forgot one." Drawer 27 opened again. This time it was no longer empty. A body lay beneath the white sheet. A detective's uniform sleeve was visible. Slowly, Ethan reached forward and lifted the edge of the sheet. He froze. The face beneath it was his own. Its eyes suddenly opened. The body whispered, "You arrived exactly on time." The lights exploded into darkness. A freezing hand gripped Ethan's wrist. He tore himself free and ran blindly through the corridors until he crashed through the front entrance. Outside, dawn was breaking. Police officers arrived minutes later after losing contact with him. They searched the entire building. Every drawer was closed. The electricity had never been restored. There was no sign that anyone had entered the morgue for years. Only Ethan's flashlight remained inside, lying beside drawer 27. Its batteries were still working. Its beam pointed directly at the drawer. Scratched into the steel as though carved by unseen fingernails were fresh words that had not been there before. Reserved for the next investigation. Ethan resigned a month later and never spoke publicly about that night. Yet every November, just before midnight, his home telephone rings once. No number ever appears. When he answers, he hears only the slow sound of a metal drawer being pulled open, followed by a quiet voice asking, "Are you ready to come back?" The cabin that waited in the fog. Deep within the forests of the French Alps stood a forgotten wooden cabin that appeared on no hiking maps. The locals called it the waiting cabin. According to an old legend, it never stayed in the same place for long. Travelers who became lost in heavy fog sometimes found it standing among the trees. Those who entered often returned. But they never told the same story. Ethan Brooks, a 32-year-old park ranger, had spent years rescuing hikers from the mountains. He trusted maps, radios, and experience, not ghost stories. So when 3 campers reported seeing a lit cabin that disappeared by sunrise, Ethan decided to investigate. Late one autumn afternoon, a thick fog rolled through the forest. The trees faded into pale shadows, and every sound seemed strangely distant. Ethan followed the campers' directions until he noticed a warm light glowing between the pines. There it was. A small wooden cabin with smoke rising from its chimney. The door stood slightly open. "Hello?" Ethan called. No one answered. Inside, the fireplace burned quietly. A kettle whistled over the flames, and 2 cups sat on a rough wooden table. Everything looked recently used, yet the room was covered with dust, as though no one had lived there for years. Then he heard footsteps upstairs. Slow. Measured. 1, 2, 3. Ethan climbed the narrow staircase. The upper room was empty. Only an old rocking chair moved gently beside a cracked window. Back downstairs, the kettle had stopped whistling. One of the cups now held fresh tea. The other remained empty. A note rested beside them. 1 cup for the guest. Ethan looked around. No one. He backed toward the door. It would not open. The handle refused to move. A cold breeze swept through the room, even though every window was closed. From somewhere behind the walls came a faint whisper. "Stay until sunrise." The voice was calm, almost kind. Ethan switched on his radio. Only static answered. Between the bursts of noise, another voice emerged. "Do not drink." He spun around. The room was empty again. The whisper returned. Closer this time. "Stay?" The rocking chair upstairs began moving faster. Then footsteps echoed across the ceiling. Not above the cabin. On the roof. Something heavy was walking in slow circles. Each step made the wooden beams groan. Without warning, the front door opened by itself. Relieved, Ethan rushed outside. The forest had vanished. Beyond the porch lay only endless white fog. No trees, no trail, no mountains, just silence. Behind him, someone gently cleared their throat. An elderly woman stood beside the fireplace. She wore an old grey dress and smiled warmly. "I've been waiting for you," she said. "I don't know you," Ethan replied. "You don't?" She pointed toward the empty teacup. "But the cabin does." As she spoke, framed photographs slowly appeared on the walls. Each picture showed different travelers standing in front of the cabin. Every face looked frightened. Every photograph included the same elderly woman. She never seemed older. She never smiled. Except in the newest frame. It was still blank. The woman looked at Ethan. "It only needs one last guest." The lights went out. Darkness swallowed the room. Ethan felt someone brush past his shoulder. He ran toward the doorway, stumbling through the darkness, until he crashed into cold earth outside. Morning sunlight filled the forest. The cabin was gone. Only moss-covered stones remained where it had stood. The rescue team found Ethan hours later, exhausted but unharmed. He insisted there had been a cabin. No maps showed one. No satellite images ever had. Weeks passed. Life returned to normal. Then one rainy evening, Ethan unpacked the backpack he had carried that night. Inside, tucked beneath his compass, rested a porcelain teacup he'd never taken. Steam slowly rose from it. A folded note lay underneath. This time, it read only one sentence. "Thank you for leaving before sunrise." As Ethan stared at the words, a soft knock echoed from somewhere outside his home. 3 slow knocks. Exactly like the footsteps he had heard on the cabin roof. When he looked through the window, thick white fog had settled across his yard. And barely visible within, it stood a small wooden cabin, waiting once again